Good morning. As Drew said, I am going to talk about money because I'm an economist, but not all the time. What I want to think about is, to start off with, how do people make decisions? How do people decide things? Now, economists have got a very clear view about this. And for people who are not economists, it's hard to understand how powerful economics is in decision making. I mean, it really dominates. The ideas of economics completely dominate, not just the things we see in the press, but completely dominate the way political decisions are made. I mean, some of you may have seen the other day, earlier this week, Boris was saying about, he didn't agree with a minimum price of alcohol to solve binge drinking. But that's a traditional way. Somebody will advise the government, people are drinking too much alcohol. What do? Well, if you put a minimum price on some strong drink, you put the price up, people will react and consume less. That's the idea. But an economist will have thought of that. It permeates decisions. And even in the marketing world, where people are more creative, essentially, the marketing world is still driven by the view that people, if you like, when they're making a decision, when they're making a choice, they actually look at the attributes of a product or service, they gather that information, they process it internally with their preference and say, yes, I'll buy it or not. And that still dominates essentially the way marketing people think. So this idea of rational choice, really dominates. And essentially, you assured me this would work when I actually...
Other way.
Oh, there we go. Okay. Now this is it. This is the way economists think people behave. Here's Mr. Spock. Maybe a little bit, a bit passé for many of you, but he dominated my youth. He was a very rational thinker from Star Trek. Here he is. He could think completely rationally and do all sorts of things. And essentially, this is the view people have of how people take decisions, both in political policy and in marketing. Now, my view is that often it's much more like this. This is how the world. We think about how you make decisions in your own companies or even in your own lives. The future is inherently uncertain. At every point, we might take a decision, it takes us down a different path. And it gets so complicated that when we look back, it's very hard to actually decide, even looking back, what would have been the best policy, even apparently quite simple decisions. So the world is much more full of uncertainty than the rational world of economics suggests. So how do we cope in these circumstances? How do people really decide? We think it's got important implications for policy. And I'll come on to talk about financial markets and the recession and the recovery. It's not a Dr. Spot world. It's a world where people face a puzzle about the future. It's inherently uncertain which path to take. It's not clear which of those paths is best. No matter how much analysis you do in advance, you can't be sure that you've taken the right decision. Now, my first foray into money is this. Here's a major industry. The fashion industry of the world. And here's, some of you may recognize, Coco Rocha, who is a major figure, earns stupendous amounts of money. Here's a multi-billion-dollar industry, world famous. Now, some Americans did a study of the major world fashion shows in a particular year. And they actually looked and said, well, how many times did people appear at these fashion shows? And in this year, Coco was the number one. She appeared in 55 shows. And the next one did 38 and so forth. And there were about 30 who did more than 20. And then there were about another 50 who did between 6 and 20. Then there were 677 who only did 1 to 5. And of course, then there were a whole thousands on the books of agencies who did none. Now, we'd like to, if an economist looks at this, we think, well, she must have the people who did really well, really much better than the average, which is very low, must have some special qualities. And what they did was actually looked at the attributes they measured, not just the physical characteristics, but the colour of the hair, the colour of the eyes, qualitative characteristics, and compared the very few who were extremely successful with people who had just appeared in 2 or 3 shows. And there was no difference. between the attributes of those who were very successful and those who only appeared in 2 or 3 shows, the market average. No difference at all. So if you like this idea of rational choice, that in some way that she was selected because she was better or special, doesn't seem to have applied. It just seems to have been almost a random process. You know, she gets chosen for one, so people copy it, think there's something special about her. Now, certainly if you're in creative industries, I mean, that's sort of, I mean, I'm not getting into technicalities here, but it's early in the morning, but that sort of statistical distribution where a few people do spectacularly well, and most people, are getting virtually no money at all, that's a characteristic outcome in anything to do with the internet, anything to do with creative industries. Think of, say film producers. Economists have got a measure of income inequality called the Gini coefficient, and if it's 100, one person has got all the money in the world, and if it's 0, everybody's got an equal amount. Now, people are very concerned about, say, America or Britain. Now, in America, this coefficient, say, it can go between 0 and 100, is about 45. There are different measures. For film producers, it's 92. So a few people scoop the pool. And this is characteristic. So we must think in some way they're better. Maybe they are, but here's an industry, and here's an example where it's very difficult to decide. It appears success isn't necessarily. Now, here's another market we're all familiar with. A very, very complex market, very complex products. I mean, how do we make choices in this market? Now, I've gone, how did I decide to buy mine? Well, look, Christ, I mean, there might be people who know how these work or what their different attributes are, but I don't. So when a few years ago, I decided to get one, I go in the office and say, what have you got? To a couple of people, and they say, well, you've got one of these. Does it work? Yes. So that's why I got it. I just copied it. I didn't try and compare the attributes and look and see what did they do. Now, some people here might do that, but that's a minority, a distinct minority. We make a shortcut. We just copy. And copying can be self-reinforcing once something gets a market lead. We're not behaving like economists. We're not trying to do rational calculations. These products are too complex to evaluate. Now, another way in which the world has been, so we got lots of complex products which are hard to evaluate, and so to cut through that fog of uncertainty, we don't carry out rational calculations. We copy off people we might trust or whose opinions we count on. We just ask people, so what did you do? And that's how we make decisions. Not just that, it's not just in terms of the complexity of products, and this is something which most of you here won't be able to appreciate, but there's been, in my view, a complete transformation in the last 20 or 30 years with just how many products and services there are. I mean, there's always been a lot, it's not that we were down the salt mines or something when I was a lad, but it's just there's a stupendous proliferation. Now, McKinsey's have done an estimate that on any single day in New York City alone, there is a person could choose from 10 billion products and services. Now, even if they're wrong by a factor of 10, and these are estimates after all, they've not gone around and counted them all, there'd still be a billion things to choose from. Now, it's impossible to process these things rationally. And so here we have a highly complex world, highly complicated products, a vast multiplicity of choices. And so people are increasingly not making decisions rationally, but are actually, in the economic sense, it doesn't mean they're irrational, it makes sense just to copy. And I think this has a profound implications for how our world actually works, which politicians haven't yet caught up with. Now, just to switch before I come in to talk about money, here's a completely different example of copying. Here's a bit of ideology. Now, I'm sure I'm not making any comments on the quality of the recent jury, by the way, but I'm sure you're all very well educated and recognise this as an iconic moment in English history. The burning of the Protestant martyrs under Queen Mary. So by historical accident, England become Protestant, then Queen Mary's a Catholic, comes to the throne. And actually, she actually operated a policy of incentives. And she says to the Protestant bishops, if you'll just convert to Catholicism, I don't mind what you think privately, as long as you obey the Catholic Mass, you can still be a bishop. And if you don't, I'll burn you to death. No. So that's a pretty clear incentive, But here we see them at this famous burning in Oxford, two of the leaders, and many of them were quite willing to do this. Because what they were trying to trigger, and think about modern ideological movements, think of Al-Qaeda or whatever, all sorts of movements around the world. There's a marvellous book called Fox's Book of Martyrs, which is a contemporaneous book, which describes, and they had a deliberate policy. They said, well, if we actually behave properly, massive crowds turned up. There might not seem many there, but in contemporaneous, if we translate into contemporary terms, the crowds are the equivalent of 500,000. Compared to the size of the population, turn up to watch. It's a major spectacle. And they came to see how they behaved when they were being burnt to death. And they said, if we, in the famous speeches, play the man. That was, he said, play the man. We'll light a candle in England that'll never go out. Because we were spreading the idea of copying. People would talk about, yes, he behaved very well. And they'd be persuaded, not on rational grounds, but in terms of simply copying by observing. And it proved to be a terrific success. Now, moving on to financial markets. Here's another area, going on to talk about money now. Does rational analysis apply in financial markets? If you're the Chancellor, how do you deal with the economy? How do you deal with financial markets? Awful lot of copying goes on. These people are not actually looking at the attributes of the various stocks and looking at the projected price-earnings ratios. They're looking around to see what everybody else is doing and making their decisions accordingly. How do we get financial booms? In the last financial boom, debt was rising and rising and rising and rising, far beyond previous historical highs. Nobody paid any attention. Then a few eccentrics start to criticise it and say this is getting a bit high. Yes, yes, yes. And then more and more. And suddenly, very quickly, in the late summer of 2007, there was a major credit crunch. The banks stopped lending to each other. A few days ago, they'd been lending. There wasn't a major event. When we see major events, we're trained intellectually to look for a major cause, some big thing happening. Nothing happened. 1 week they were happy to lend to each other. The next minute they weren't. They processed the same data in different ways. It spread across the network from being optimistic to being pessimistic. And think about these arguments, all these very complex arguments about austerity policies and should there be fiscal expansion and what's happening in Spain. Now, we can see, say, in Spain, have got problems. I mean, their interest rates have sometimes been 8%. And ours are 2. These are on government bonds. Massive difference. And the Spanish varies between 5 and 8, and ours seems to be stuck at around 2. Huge difference. But if we actually look at the size of public debt in Spain relative to its economy, the size of public debt in the UK relative to its economy, they're virtually the same. There is virtually no difference. And yet somehow, the British, this is one of the great coups of the coalition government. Somehow, after the election, they persuaded people that in some way the British government finances were sound, and it's a confidence trick that the Spanish haven't pulled off. And there's no difference in terms of the objective attributes of public sector debt. It's a matter of perception and narrative. Does this story spread? Which story gets traction on the markets? It's not necessarily rational analysis, in fact almost certainly not rational analysis, because there's little difference in the... So how do you pull this off? It's a different way of thinking about policy. How do we actually connect in a world like this? There isn't the lever to pull, the button to press. It's not a machine, it's more like a biological organism, the economy. We prod it, and we think it'll jump there, but it might just suddenly jump on top of us instead. We just don't know which way it will go in the same way. It's much more about control of narrative. And one way of trying to understand, you've seen the paper about the euro crisis, sometimes it seems to calm down, sometimes it flares up again. Because for 2 years there's been a struggle for dominance of our narrative on the markets about Europe. And in a sense, it's not going to go away until it's resolved one way or the other. We won't be able to make progress and get out of this until a dominant narrative emerges. And in one sense, it doesn't matter what it is. Either the narrative is the euro is going to collapse, in which case there'll be a bit of chaos, then people will sort it out, Or the narrative is going to be, no, it's fine, it's going to go ahead, and then we'll resume service as normal. But as long as this is uncertainty, this competition for narrative, not about objective facts, then these uncertainties are going to continue. Now, I've got some time planning. Oh. Now, here's some more policy examples. I've talked about economic recession and recovery. Just briefly, there's a big argument. Should there be, should the government have a different policy? Well, the big issue is that British companies are sitting on vast piles of cash. They were very sensible. Compared to the 1930s, when there was a Great Depression, companies behaved quite differently. And when the recession hit, they protected their balance sheets, right? And they actually postponed investment decisions, and they've built up huge piles of cash. This is major companies I'm talking about now. Of course, you'll read in the press about companies going under, because there's been a prolonged period, of slow growth or recession. But the ones which are surviving and doing okay are doing very well. They've got piles of cash, and nobody is investing. In a recession, the easiest thing to do, you stop your investment programs, and your cash piles up, and it's sitting there. Now, if they start to spend, there'll be a boom. This happened in the 1930s. Unemployment halved in 3 years. The companies they eventually rebuilt their balance sheets, but it took them longer. And when they started to spend, when they had the confidence to spend, the economy boomed. There's a massive boom. In terms of the economy as a whole, much faster than the 1980s. And unemployment halved in 3 years. So the real key to recovery is, how do you trigger? At the moment, they're holding back. They're all looking at each other. They're not doing rational analysis. They employ people like me to do rational analysis, and they pay no attention because they look and see what everybody else is doing. And as long as everybody else is holding back, they don't want to be the first ones to make a jump and commit to a major investment project. How do you actually send a signal? How do you unlock? How does that confidence return? Because when some start to spend, they'll look around and see and say, yes, we'll do that. Because there's a big backlog of investment projects to carry out. It's a big backlog. One of the reasons America's doing better, it's not perfect, American companies in the same position, and some of them have been spending for a couple of years. So the American economy is going better. It's not going perfectly, but it's now doing better than it was before the recession. Unemployment comes down. Employment's being created in a genuine sense with proper wages, not just a result of wage cuts. Because somehow the sentiment amongst companies has altered. Let me move on. Worklessness, well, that's similar. But let's think about climate change. How do we persuade people? It's not about rational analysis. It's an area not about rational analysis at all. It's about how opinions spread across networks. How are people going to be persuaded? I'll read, because just for historical reasons, I still read The Guardian. And I love to see adverts for holidays in eco lodges in Ecuador, to be environmentally friendly. And I think, how are you going to get there? How? But until, if people are really worried about it, the economists would say, yes, if you're worried about emissions, we know how to solve the problem, and they do. So, okay, let's make diesel, £10 a litre. Well, then virtually nobody's going to drive a car. That's easy. It's not a problem. We can do that. But no government would survive. No government could do that and get away with it. It's only by internalising a change of behaviour, by persuading on a network, by being convinced and being supported by peer acceptance, that things will change on that. Obesity, binge drinking. Well, yeah, big problem. These are big social issues. What we're going to do, a fat tax, a super drinks tax? Yeah, maybe. But these are much more about peer acceptance, about what's acceptable behaviour. Obesity, well, even 30 years ago in schools, sometimes the fat child will be pointed out and ridiculed. And now, if in a class, if half the people are fat, it's much more acceptable to be fat. It's not that people are deliberately copying and see a fat person and say, I'll go out and have 10 pizzas, I want to be fat. But it's a question of, what's acceptable. And this makes, this is very puzzling and challenging for policymakers, because this is how the world is. Incentives still matter. We might be able to do something with a few price changes, but they're not going to get very far as long as it's okay to be fat. How do you actually get into that network? It's a major challenge. Like the same way with financial markets, same way with the companies. How do we actually get these narratives to spread across networks in a positive way? Now, just my final point. I'm not mastering this technology right now. I'm originally from Rochdale. Now, as it happens, I was talking to Drew, and he disappointed me being Australian. I thought he'd be a rugby league fan, but he's not. But leaving that aside, I still follow Rochdale Football Club. They're not very good. The least successful side ever in the history of British football. They've been in the bottom division almost all their lives. But I thought this was brilliant. I might as well have just given this and sat down. Right? Anyone with a Twitter account and a blog is an expert. Volume overtakes quality in many people's eyes. And that seems the sort of world in which we're in. And it's this whole point about copying. It might not be the best product that succeeds. It might not be the objectively most sound economy that gets reflected best in the markets. It's all more about telling stories, about telling narratives, getting people to copy and to persuade. And that seems to me to be a fundamental problem. So policy, much more about narrative, both public and private, rather than it is about the traditional tools of incentives. They're not irrelevant, but they're very much second order. I really think the world has been transformed. So thanks very much.
Thanks.
Okay, the question is about this concept of nudge, which some of you might have read, Kahneman's book, Thinking Fast, Thinking Slow. Now, I'm a great admirer of Kahneman intellectually. What he's done is actually, because he comes from psychology, he got the Nobel Prize in economics, but he's a psychologist. And he's actually made much more careful analysis of how people really do behave. Now, this is a step forward, but I'm talking about something different. He's describing how people behave still in the traditional model of individuals. How do you actually, you may not be completely rational when you're making decisions about, say, buying a pension or your attitude to risk. You might have different ways of behaving, the economists think. But he's not talking about a connected world. He's not talking about you try and say, well, there might be smarter ways. They're partly relying on this. So, for example, think about the revenue, the tax authorities are trying to do this. Or when a council tries to persuade people to do recycling, they might circulate a leaflet, say, 53 people in your road are already recycling. So they're trying to promote peer acceptance. So they're getting there. They're actually moving towards this idea of trying to persuade people to do things simply because other people do them. And I think, as I say, it's a very powerful, it doesn't always succeed, it's not a guarantee of success. And your question is, well, is this patronising? Is it patronising to, this is a difficult question, put up interest rates? I don't know. Somebody's got to do it. Are you saying that, the people who decide that are somehow cleverer than the ones who don't? It's a bit patronising to say you're allowed to set interest rates. I suppose, but the rationale, overall is, governments are ultimately elected, and if we think we're being too patronised, we can kick them out. That's the ultimate response to governments. If people have got a big following, they may be regarded as experts. This is the point. If your products are successful, the traditional view of the world is to say there must be something special about it. Now, there might be, but the whole point is, in this connected world, there might not be. It may be no different from the market average, but it's just successful because people see it as successful. Everybody's buying X, and so you go along and buy X, regardless of its qualities. Now, this has always been a feature of some bits of the world, but it's now much more pervasive. So people are thought as experts because people think they're experts. That's all. It's just this perception. The people who follow them, why bother following somebody unless you think they've got something to offer? So people are followed for that reason, because many people follow them. And like I say, if you think about anything to do with the creative world, which is very, very broad now, there'll be a few people, a few things which are very successful, and a long tail of things which are not. And there may be no objective difference between them. It's just one's become regarded as being successful. And this is the world in which we are. Now, I think the policy response ought to be much more, and companies get it better than governments, much more experimental. Just try a few things out rather than committing to major policies. Let's try and see what works. Let's try different things and see if something spreads and gets taken up, is successful. More along these lines of just little bits at a time without committing to everything. Then we can step back and try something else and be more willing to embrace the idea that things fail. That most things in a world like this aren't going to succeed because they won't get broad acceptance. Even if they might be objectively the best, they still might not get taken up. So if we experiment more and more willing to accept failure and innovate more, initiate more experiments, more trials, and then something might get that traction and spread across the network and be very successful. It's not that economists can predict. Look, economists have not got a good record of predicting the economy anyway, and it's actually very bad. So it's not as though there's a successful model that I want to overthrow. I'm saying there's a very poor model. It's actually a very difficult problem. The way to get into it is to think much more about, not about the objective attributes. Obviously, if something's just stupendously better, then it's going to succeed. But most situations aren't like that. There's genuine doubt about which is best. It's much more about the structure of connections in that particular context. Who's connected to who? How many connections have you got? And who adopts it first of all? And what the people around them, how persuadable the people around them are like. Now, let me just give an example now. How you'd acquire this information is a different matter. Let me just give an example. Let's say, in this world, there's a new product I've invented, nobody's got it, and then you buy it at random, right? And then you're connected to a few people in the room, and a lot depends how persuadable they are. They look at you, and some of your friends may want lots of reassurance, but may want most of their social group to take it up before they're willing to adopt a completely new product or new service. Some may be very experimental and say, yeah, he's got it, I'll try that as well. Now, if you're surrounded by people who are very experimental, if you're chosen, then there'll be immediately a sort of, like a block who might then percolate it further. So, but if all your friends are pretty reluctant to experiment, it's not going to go any further. So it's much more about the people who adopt, who they know, are they willing to adopt. It's much more about the structure of the network than the, if you like, the objective attributes of the product. And these are very hard problems, but progress is being made on that. We're not saying anything can happen. No, there are reasons. And we can think about it. We just need different ways of thinking about this sort of policy, and these, whether it's in the commercial world or whether it's in the political world. Very difficult ones. In fact, a friend of mine, he's Australian. He's done some very innovative work in alternative views of trying to understand the economy. Slightly different from mine, but they're very interesting. And on his website, he's tried, crowdfunding. He's got some money in through this, say if you like to support, but he's tried different ways. He's got some money from some other sources, from more conventional sources. But yeah, crowdfunding, that's ideal. That's just perfectly relying. That's a very good example of reliance on networks. And it doesn't necessarily mean that a good idea, the traditional way of thinking would be to say, right, then a really good idea is going to get more money from crowdfunding than one that isn't quite as good in some objective way, however we define it. But that's not true, is it? Some very good ideas don't get money, this source. Some which are not as good, they have to have some properties. They can't just be complete rubbish. But once you pass the sort of minimal quality threshold, an idea which is not as good may get more money that way. But crowdfunding isn't exactly picking up this idea of it's the connections and the networks and the word of mouth that matters. Yes, there is a critical mass, and the follow-up is to say we don't always know what that is. This is still being worked out. Because a lot of this, there's a massive mathematical science grown up in the last 10, 20 years about networks. It's just a boom area. A few sort of weirdos did it before. There was something called network theory, but now it's a red hot topic. And yes, it's lower than most people. I can say it's lower than most people would think. But it's hard to generalise. But it seems to be more once something gets to about 15-20%. In many markets, many situations, you often, let's just say there are two choices, just to simplify it. You don't often see I've given the example of the Eurozone, which is an immediate counter-example, but in general, you don't see many examples where it's like 40-60. It's either 15-20 or it's 80. So there does seem to be, but in some areas it doesn't mean critical mass can be much smaller. There are many issues here, but yes, there is a critical mass, and it's smaller than you might think. Is all I can say. I don't know any more than that. If I did, I'd get the Nobel Prize. But